People are always looking for somewhere that they belong, a place with like-minded people who understand them, and most importantly, a leader, a guide who can show them the way. Of course, things seem great at first, but it doesn't take long before the true nature of these groups, more specifically the leaders, comes out. The leaders desire one thing: control over their followers. They want the followers to do whatever they say and give them whatever they want. And of course, they want their followers to be willing to die and possibly even kill for them. And that's when you realize this isn't a big happy family that these people have joined. It's a cult. And in this video, I'll be looking at 7 of them. Here are 7 of the most dark and disturbing cults. One of these cults literally only had 4 people in it, but everywhere I've read about them lists them as a cult, so they count. In the early 1970s, Marshall Herff Applewhite was searching for meaning amid personal crisis. A former Texas music teacher, Applewhite began struggling with depression and apocalyptic visions. In 1972, he crossed paths with Bonnie Lou Nettles, a Houston nurse with an interest in astrology and UFOs. They felt an instant connection and soon became convinced that they shared a divine mission, even believing they were the 2 prophetic witnesses foretold in the Book of Revelations. By 1974, Applewhite and Nettles had founded a new religious group that came to be known as Heaven's Gate. Applewhite and Nettles, who took the names Doe and T respectively, traveled the American West, preaching an unorthodox blend of Christian apocalyptic prophecy and UFO lore. They promised that a spaceship would soon arrive to carry faithful followers away to a higher plane of existence. In 1975, the pair held recruitment meetings in California and Oregon, attracting a small band of devotees willing to abandon their families and all worldly ties to join them. Those who answered the call dropped out of society immediately. Looking to Applewhite and Nettles, dubbed the 2 as leaders. When no UFO arrived as predicted, Heaven's Gate shifted from anticipation to perseverance. Through the late 1970s and early 1980s, members lived a nomadic communal life under an increasingly strict regime. They camped in remote areas and later moved between quiet safe houses, maintaining secrecy and disciplined daily routines. Followers relinquished all worldly possessions, severed contact with family, and embraced strict celibacy. In time, even more extreme measures were taken to uphold their monastic lifestyle. At least 8 male members, including Applewhite, voluntarily underwent castration surgery to demonstrate total renunciation of earthly desire. Within the cult, Applewhite wielded absolute authority, while Nettles was his co-leader. In 1985, however, Bonnie Nettles died of liver cancer, a blow that threatened to upend the group's doctrine. Until then, Heaven's Gate had taught that members would ascend to the next level without experiencing death. Nettles' death forced a change in teaching. Applewhite told followers that she had simply shed her earthly vehicle and moved on to the next level ahead of them. Dying, he explained, was not a failure for the faithful, but a necessary step to truly leave Earth and reach the heavenly kingdom. By the early 1990s, Heaven's Gate re-emerged from seclusion. Applewhite, now the sole leader, still led a core of devoted followers and sought new converts. In the early internet era, the group even started a business designing websites under the name Higher Source to fund their activities, and they created their own website to spread Heaven's Gate teachings. They lived quietly, convinced that a cosmic sign would one day signal when it was time to depart Earth. That sign seemed to come in 1997, with the appearance of Comet Hale-Bopp, amid rumors that an alien spacecraft was trailing the comet. For Applewhite, this was prophecy fulfilled. He announced that the long-awaited exit was imminent. The spaceship was finally coming to collect them. As the Hale-Bopp comet drew near, Applewhite's tone grew urgent. He recorded video addresses in which he told his adherents it was time to leave their human vehicles and ascend to the next level. In these final recordings, Applewhite assured the quote, class, as he called his followers, that what the outside world viewed as suicide was not truly death at all, but rather a way to exit Earth for a higher existence. On Heaven's Gate's website, the group posted an essay titled, Our Position Against Suicide, arguing that to stay behind, to refuse the call to evolve, would be the true suicide. In Applewhite's eyes, they were not self-destructing, they were graduating from the human level. The cult even signaled its own intentions with a final public message on their website, a notice proclaiming that the Hale-Bopp comet's arrival brings closure to Heaven's Gate, and that their 22-year classroom on Earth was at an end. They were, the note said, prepared to leave this world and go with T's crew. In late March 1997, Heaven's Gate carried out its endgame at a rented mansion in the San Diego suburb of Rancho Santa Fe. Over 2 days, all 39 members of the group, 21 women and 18 men, died by suicide in a carefully orchestrated sequence. By the end of that weekend, 39 people lay dead, convinced they were bound for a spaceship hidden behind the comet. On March 26, 1997, 3 days after the suicides, an anonymous tip from a former member led sheriff's deputies to the Rancho Santa Fe house, where they encountered a grisly yet orderly scene. The bodies lay face up on bunk beds and mattresses, each covered with a square of purple cloth. All 39 victims were clad in the same attire: black shirts and sweatpants, brand new Nike sneakers, and patches on their sleeves that read, "Heaven's Gate Away Team." Personal bags and identification documents were nearby. Investigators noted that every victim carried a $5 bill and a handful of quarters in their pocket, a final token that may have been intended as a fare for the journey beyond. For most of the world, the story of Heaven's Gate ended with those 39 deaths. Yet one part of the cult lives on: the group's website, which Applewhite and his followers had set up before their departure, remained online after the incident. It was left up with a farewell message, and it continues to be maintained by a few surviving devotees. 2 former Heaven's Gate members have ensured that the site stays running for decades, quietly paying the hosting bills and even responding to the occasional email. Even now, the Heaven's Gate webpage is still accessible, preserved like a time capsule of the cult's unusual beliefs and final farewell to the world. Also, the cult was parodied on the 3rd ever episode of Family Guy of all things.
I'm so glad you could join us, Meg. We're gonna have a great time on our trip.
A trip? Like to the beach? Because I didn't bring my bathing suit.
Oh, you won't need anything for where we're going. Excuse me, I've gotta go mix the punch.
The whole poison punch thing is obviously more of a reference to Jonestown, but the cult members talking about going on a journey and the leader talking about ascension and stuff like that, it's pretty obvious that this is supposed to be Heaven's Gate.
He must think I'm a total dog.
Oh, that is so not true.
Then what is it?
He's a eunuch.
Really?
Sure. All the guys here have been castrated. It's cool. Ooh, our leader is here to take us on our journey.
My children, rejoice. The hour of transformation is close at hand.
Come on, kids, let's get going. Sorry, Meg. I guess it's another bunch of people who'd rather fake their own death than go to a party with you.
Children, the time of ascension has arrived. Oh, for the love of God, haven't any of you ever been in a cult before?
Robin Geck's story began in a northwest side Chicago duplex. Born in 1953, he bounced between menial carpentry gigs and midnight laundry shifts, cultivating a reputation for clockwork punctuality that masked a labyrinth of obsessions. Co-workers later told reporters that Geck once spent several weeks drywalling for John Wayne Gacy, a job that convinced him, they said, that suburban normalcy could camouflage anything at all. Sometime in 1980, he decided to give his attic a rather sinister makeover and painted every surface, floorboards, rafters, even the single light bulb, deep crimson. At the center, he built a rough plywood altar draped with red velvet. A 14-inch Bowie knife and a cigar box lined in the same velvet lay on top. Geck called the space, quote, the chapel, and he treated it as both a confessional and a laboratory. He spent evenings there, rehearsing rites pieced together from occult pamphlets and King James verses until the choreography felt effortless. The congregation he assembled was small, but pliable. Edward Spreitzer, an overweight auto shop helper Geck met at a Southside drag strip, craved belonging and found it in Geck's offhand praise. Then came Villa Park brothers Andrew and Thomas Kokorales, quiet roofers from a strict Greek household who were drawn first by Geck's stash of beer and metal LPs and later by the notion that Satan could reward loyalty better than any union boss. By the end of 1981, the four called themselves the Ripper Crew, though investigators would eventually dub them the Chicago Rippers. Their scripture ran a single, blood-dark sentence: pain brings power. The ritual they planned was methodical: cruise the city in a battered red Dodge van, abduct a lone woman, usually a sex worker or commuter, bind her with baling wire, Gecht carved a shallow cross between her ribs and severed one breast with surgical patience, while chanting warped Bible fragments. Each follower masturbated over the wound, believing the act, quote, fed the Dark One. The breast went into the velvet box to be diced into thumb-sized cubes and swallowed, washed down with old-style beer, while an Ozzy Osbourne cassette played a low volume in case the neighbours were listening in. The first confirmed victim was Linda Sutton, who vanished on May 23, 1981, after leaving a Villa Park motel. Her body surfaced 10 days later in a weeded lot, wrists wired, one breast removed, with chilling precision. For months, the files gathered dust until May 15, 1982, when Lorraine Borowski disappeared while opening a real estate office in Elmhurst. A summer barrage followed. Angel York was stabbed and thrown from a moving van, but survived. Sandra Delaware turned up beneath a Goose Island bridge, wrists punctured by a piano wire. Factory worker Shui Mack was dumped in a South Loop alley, mutilated identically to Sutton. Despite the consistent surgical incisions, detectives chalked each case to random sadism, failing to trace the ritual spine running through them. The crew's bravado ballooned. They even debated snatching a nun for what Spritzer bragged would be, quote, the ultimate sacrifice. They never realized a living witness had already memorized their getaway vehicle. That witness was 20-year-old Beverly Washington. Gecht picked her up just after midnight on October 6, 1982. He tranquilized her in the van, performed the ritual cuts on the move, and dumped her beside a railroad embankment. She clamped torn clothing against her chest, crawled toward distant headlights, and lived. From her hospital bed, she delivered a description of her captor's vehicle, a red 1975 Dodge van. Patrol officers matched it within a week to Gecht's contracting firm. Interrogations toppled the cult in sequence. Thomas Cocorales cracked after 48 hours and spoke of how Rob placed the breast into the box. Andrew supplied details of drive-by shotgun killings they committed for, quote, laughs. Spritzer confessed to at least 5 murders and described vivid nightmares whenever he missed a ritual. Only Gecht stayed stone-faced, leaning on a public defender's advice to speak 0 syllables. Even so, fiber matches, tire tracks, and Washington's adamant testimony anchored him to the case. Trials ran from 1983 to 1985 across 2 counties. Gecht, convicted of attempted murder, rape, and aggravated battery, accumulated sentences that add up to 120 years, just shy of a natural death order. Spritzer and Andrew Cocorales landed on death row. Andrew was injected on March 17, 1999, the last prisoner Illinois executed before its moratorium. A 2003 clemency sweep commuted Spritzer to life. Thomas drew 70 years and walked free in 2019. Maynard Correctional Center still receives Gecht's handwritten motions, each arguing that breast mutilation alone cannot prove satanic motive. For years, 4 blue-collar laborers practiced a theology of knives and fear, treating women's bodies as ritual currency and Chicago's alleyways as their sanctuary of blood. Adolfo de Jesus Costanza was born in Miami on November 1, 1962, to a Cuban mother who blended Catholic ritual with Afro-Caribbean spiritism in the family apartment. Short visits to Haiti and Puerto Rico exposed him to Palo Mayombe ceremonies that used animal blood and human relics. As a teenager, he served as an assistant to a Miami priest of that tradition, learning how bones, herbs, and iron cauldrons could be marketed to people who wanted protection from criminal rivals. When the priest died in 1981, Costanzo moved to Mexico City, adopted the title El Padrino, and began charging traffickers and police for what he called strong work, cleansing rites meant to keep their operations free of interference. Between 1984 and 1986, he recruited a small core of followers who handled weapons, bookkeeping, and recruitment while he performed the rituals. His version of Palo Mayombe kept the traditional nganga, an iron pot said to hold a gilded spirit, yet mixed in Catholic icons and details pulled from Santeria and Aztec lore. Costanzo staged ceremonies that featured roosters or goats and sometimes zebras purchased from the Mexico City Zoo. The performance value impressed potential clients and expanded his network into Tamaulipas, where the Hernandez family moved marijuana across the border near Matamoros. In exchange for a share of each shipment, Costanzo blessed their loads and offered spells to misdirect US agents. The partnership supplied enough money to purchase Rancho Santa Elena, a 400-acre property about 30 kilometers west of Matamoros, and to arm a private guard force with rifles and radios. Sarah Maria Aldrate met Costanzo in 1987. She was a physical education student at Texas Southmost College, who crossed into Matamoros daily from Brownsville. Costanzo told her she carried priestly authority from a previous life. The promise of status and income drew her into the group. She stopped attending classes and accepted the role of La Madrina. Aldrate organized vehicles, forged documents, safe houses, and schedules, allowing Costanzo to concentrate on ritual and intimidation. Costanzo believed larger sacrifices would strengthen the Unganga, and by extension, the trafficking business that financed the cult. Victims were first taken from rival gangs that resisted paying for protection. In 1988, several members of the Calzada family disappeared after refusing his partnership. Their remains were recovered with fingers, ears, and in one case, the spine removed. Costanzo's inner circle understood the removal of specific body parts as mandatory offerings that empowered the spirit. By early 1989, Costanzo insisted that the next ritual include a, quote, superior brain. On the night of March 14, 1989, a scout team patrolling Matamoros bars targeted Mark Kilroy, a 21-year-old University of Texas pre-med student separated from his friends during spring break. He was forced into a pickup truck and driven to the ranch. 12 hours later, he was killed with a machete blow to the neck. The brain was removed and boiled with herbs, and the torso was buried in a shallow pit already containing earlier victims. Kilroy's US citizenship turned what had been regional disappearances into an international investigation. Texas authorities pressed their Mexican counterparts for daily updates, and news outlets on both sides of the border reported the case in detail. Costanzo's organization unraveled on April 1, 1989, when Serafin Hernandez ran a police checkpoint while transporting marijuana. Officers followed him back to Rancho Santa Elena. A search produced firearms, bundles of cannabis, an altar coated with animal blood, and disturbed ground behind a cinder block shack. Forensic teams spent a week excavating 15 bodies, including Kilroy's. Many skeletons showed missing vertebrae, ribs, or fingers that had been removed for ritual use. Costanzo, Aldrate, and 4 associates fled to an apartment on Rio Seneca Street in Mexico City, taking the Unganga with them. On May 6, 1989, police acting on a tip surrounded the building. Costanzo fired an Uzi from the 5th floor window until ammunition ran out. He then ordered Alvaro de Leon to shoot him to avoid arrest. De Leon opened fire and killed both Costanzo and Lieutenant Martin Quintana. Aldrate was arrested without injury. Court proceedings spread over several years. In 1993, Aldrate received multiple sentences that added to more than 600 years. Mexican law capped her effective term at 30. Several members of the Hernandez family received 50-year sentences for homicide and drug offenses. Investigators attributed at least 26 murders to the group, although fragmentary remains suggested a higher number. 2 mid-level followers named in arrest warrants were never located. Rancho Santa Elena was later demolished, and official records list the Unganga, still containing bone fragments, as evidence stored in the capital. In 2023, HBO released the 3-part documentary La Narco Satanica, which used Aldrate's prison interviews to revisit the case and outline continued interest in occult elements of cartel culture. Today, the identified victims are buried in family plots in Texas and northern Mexico. Several graves from the ranch carry numerical markers because names remain unknown. Border inspectors continue to cite the investigation when describing how criminal gangs sometimes mix occult practice with trafficking logistics. The case remains notable for the scale of violence directed not at civilian society in general, but at specific individuals whose abduction and killing were treated as functional components of smuggling operations. In the early 1980s, French jeweler turned occultist Joseph Di Mambro rented discreet hotel suites around Geneva, spinning tales about secret Templar wisdom and a looming cosmic purification. His partner on the podium, Luc Jouret, a Belgian homeopath with a polished manner and a knack for apocalyptic prophecy, handled the charisma, while Di Mambro controlled the script. Together, in 1984, they folded their lecture circuit into a hierarchical inner order they called the International Chivalric Organization of the Solar Tradition, soon shortened by members to the Order of the Solar Temple. New recruits, mostly professionals with money to spare, were ushered through candlelit rituals that fused Masonic theatrics, with New Age space mysticism. The top initiates were told the physical world was doomed and that a select few would transit to a higher plane near the star Sirius. From the start, DeMambro made it clear, if prophecy demanded flesh, prophecy would get it. By the early 1990s, financial probes in Canada and Switzerland, plus a botched gun-running case, convinced the leadership the end was closing in. DeMambro's paranoia settled on an ex-member he once trusted, Tony Dutoit, a Swiss-Canadian craftsman who had built ceremonial props for the cult. Tony's wife, Nikki, had given birth to a son they named Christopher Emmanuel. Too close, DeMambro raged to his own daughter Emmanuelle, the group's self-styled, quote, cosmic child. On September 30th, 1994, Tony, Nikki, and 3-month-old Christopher were lured to a chalet in Morin Heights, Quebec. Two loyalists, Joel Egger and Jerry Ganaud, stabbed the couple repeatedly, then butchered Christopher with a wooden stake. The order came straight from DeMambro, who labeled the baby the Antichrist. The killers cleaned the scene, rigged incendiary timers, and flew to Europe the same night. 3 days later, smoke rose on 2 fronts in Switzerland. At a farmhouse in Sherry, investigators found a concealed ritual chamber, 23 bodies laid out in a sunwheel, most shot in the head after being sedated, a few suffocated with plastic bags. 90 miles south, the burned shells of 3 chalets at Salvon yielded 25 more corpses, many injected with poison before flames took them. Among the dead were Jurette and DeMambro themselves, dressed in crimson capes, plastic bags taped around their mouths, and a .22 caliber pistol nearby. The fires had been set with military-style timers, and farewell letters posted to friends boasted that the awakened had left Earth for a purer realm. Autopsies later showed that only a handful died by their own hand. The rest were executed. Police sealed crime scenes, but the doctrine kept circulating on photocopied Testament leaflets that promised a second wave. It arrived 15 months later in the French Alps. On December 16, 1995, 14 followers, including 3 children, were found arranged in a star pattern in a forest clearing on the Vaucours Plateau. Each had been drugged, shot with a .22 caliber pistol, soaked in gasoline, and set alight. André Friedli and Jean-Pierre Lardonche lay nearby with revolvers. Their final task completed, investigators concluded at least 4 victims were coerced or incapacitated before death. The final act unfolded back in Quebec. Before dawn on March 22, 1997, a modest house in Saint-Casimir erupted in flames. Inside were 5 Solar Temple stalwarts, Chantal and Didier Quiers, Pauline Rio, Bruno Claus, and an elderly relative. 3 teenage Quiers children staggered into the snow. Dazed from sedatives, they told police their parents had tried to drag them into a transit, but relented when the teens begged to live. As the adults lost consciousness, the teenagers set the fire at their parents' insistence and fled. Another transit letter, mailed hours later, claimed the group would, quote, continue the mission on another world. 74 people died under the Solar Temple banner between 1994 and 1997, murdered, coerced, or convinced that immolation was a doorway to salvation. The architecture of the slaughter was laid years before in dimly lit rituals where DeMambro and Jurette preached escape from a collapsing Earth. When scrutiny tightened, their theology of ascension mutated into a program of systemic killing. The Order's lodges are long abandoned, but the blueprint those 2 men drafted, faith weaponized into coordinated death, remains etched into every autopsy report and coroner's photograph pulled from the ashes. In 1987, a quiet Japanese yoga instructor launched a bizarre enterprise. Shoko Asahara, a legally blind man in his early 30s, opened a Shibuya apartment and founded Om Shinrikyo, which in English means Supreme Truth. What began as a fringe yoga and meditation class quickly drew attention. By 1989, Aum was officially recognized as a religious organization, which granted it massive tax breaks and near immunity from scrutiny. Asahara proclaimed that he had met Shiva in India and received a special mission to save Japan. He even advertised, quote, supernatural abilities. Pamphlets bragged he could levitate himself by sheer will, blending Buddhist, Hindu, and apocalyptic Christian ideas. He styled himself as a guru and fed followers a doomsday message. Under that New Age veneer, Aum Shinrikyo's recruitment machine ran on overdrive. The cult drew heavily from Japan's elite. Graduate students in chemistry, physics, and engineering came in from top universities. Its propaganda was shockingly slick for a fringe sect. They published flashy magazines and manga-style comics to hook young people, tying its creed to popular anime and sci-fi themes, space missions, secret weapons, global conspiracies, and the quest for truth. They even financed a 10-episode anime series called Choetsu Sakai, which means the Transcendental World, with an idealized, messiah-like Asahara as the hero of each episode. And if you've been on the internet long enough, you've most likely seen this image of Asahara's character on the phone. For years, this character was mistakenly identified as anime Jesus, but considering Asahara clearly saw himself as a messiah-like figure, that was probably the intention. Aum Shinrikyo's sales pitch was simple. They promised to cure illness or unlock psychic powers through ancient yoga and threefold salvation. Initiations were bizarre and brutal, reportedly involving LSD and extreme aesthetic yoga, with disciples being hung upside down or subject to shock treatment to break down the recruit's will. Shoko Asahara himself was a startling figure. In person, he was small, overweight, and had a rather unassuming look on his face. But on stage, he turned charismatic. He mixed passages from the Bible with Buddhist mantras, painting himself alternately as Christ and the end times Buddha. He told followers he had achieved cosmic enlightenment and could wield psychic powers. In lectures, he preached that Armageddon was coming, and only Aum's inner circle would survive. Around him was a cluster of cult scientists, physicists, chemists, and even doctors, whom he pressed into service, building his vision of the apocalypse. Anyone who hesitated or questioned him was suspect. Aum's early promise of salvation eventually curdled into a string of horrors. When a TV station secretly filmed lawyer Tsutsumi Sakamoto criticizing the cult in 1989, the cult struck back in gruesome fashion. Aum members abducted 33-year-old Sakamoto, his wife, and their 14-month-old son. Late at night, they beat and injected the family with potassium chloride and left them to die. Their bodies were stuffed in metal drums and hidden in 3 different mountain forests, a deliberate effort to evade detection. The law caught up only years later, but the message was clear. Resist Aum Shinrikyo, and you would vanish without a trace. The cult's reign of terror accelerated in the early 1990s. In June 1994, they quietly tested their new weapon on the citizens of Matsumoto. Sarin nerve gas was released in the evening air, supposedly to assassinate local judges. 8 people died and hundreds more became sick. Emboldened by the success of sarin, the group set its sights on Tokyo. On the morning of March 20th, 1995, at least 5 teams of cult members boarded rush-hour subway trains carrying nylon bags and umbrellas filled with sarin. In rapid succession, the gas sacks were punctured, and ordinary commuters dropped in chaos. Windows filled with steam as the gas spread. Lights came on to a dozen corpses on the platforms. By one count, 13 people were murdered, and nearly 1,000 more were wounded. Survivors were left blind, maimed, or brain damaged. In just a few minutes, Japan's most comfortable mass transit system was a crime scene. That morning shattered the illusion of Aum Shinrikyo. When police raided the group's Mount Fuji compound, the scene was surreal and terrifying. Investigators found stockpiles of chemicals and syringes, barrels of toxic waste, even a Mi-17 Soviet helicopter in the cult's base of operations. Freezers contained anthrax and Ebola samples, though these were later believed to be hoaxes or unfinished experiments. And the compound's labs had kettles of nerve gas still chilling. Thousands of liters of nerve gas, in fact, that could have killed millions. Military manuals, millions in cash and gold, and a fortune in equipment lay beside yoga mats and Bibles. Television crews filmed it all, a private death factory, hidden under the guise of paradise. Aum Shinrikyo's lies and violence were exposed for the world to see. Shogo Asahara was arrested within days. In court, he appeared frail and disoriented, still claiming the subway horror was someone else's doing. Justice may have moved slowly, but it also moved inexorably. By the time the trials concluded, Japan had endured years of gruesome testimony, worshippers who confessed to murder, technicians who described chemical weapons labs, and hidden video footage of cult rituals. Finally, in 2004, Asahara and 6 of his most senior lieutenants were sentenced to death and were finally executed by hanging in 2018 for the 1995 attack. 6 more followers were executed in July of that same year. By then, Aum Shinrikyo had long since been banned. In 2007, it formally split into 2 groups, Aleph and Hikari no Wa, both of which have lived under constant police surveillance. The saga of Aum Shinrikyo is easily one of modern Japan's darkest crime stories. A blind yoga guru turned himself into a doomsday prophet, churning out sick pamphlets, comic books, and even anime to recruit the disaffected, then massacred innocents with poison gas when prophecy failed. In the end, Asahara was executed and the cult dismantled, but its twisted legacy, survivors of terror, bizarre recruiting cartoons, and a chapter of history remains painfully real. Joseph Kibwetir, a former Roman Catholic priest from Kanungu district in southwestern Uganda, withdrew from local parish life in the late 1980s after claiming to have witnessed a Marian apparition on his land. In 1989, he met Credonia Morende, a small-town beer seller who said that she too saw the Virgin Mary and carried new instructions for building a purer church. Kibwetir supplied property and a public face. Morinde supplied prophecy and day-to-day authority. Together, they registered the movement for the restoration of the 10 Commandments of God, installing a council that included Dominic Katari Barbo, a Catholic priest who had recently returned from graduate study in the United States. The founders presented the group as an offshoot dedicated to strict observance of the Decalogue, but from the start, they operated outside official church structures, holding services in makeshift chapels and roadside shelters. Recruitment drew on 2 themes: imminent apocalypse and absolute obedience. The leadership printed a 90-page booklet, A Timely Message from Heaven, The End of the Present Time, and required new members to memorize it, reading the text as many as 6 times. Conversation was discouraged in case idle talk breached the 9th commandment of bearing false witness. On some days, communication slipped into sign language, sex was banned, soap considered unnecessary, and meals were limited to 1 per day on Mondays and Fridays. Those rules, the founders said, would guarantee survival when the world ended on the 31st December 1999. Most followers were small plot farmers from Kanungu who sold livestock or land and turned the money over to the movement. A rough internal hierarchy placed Morende at the top, former priests as theologians beneath her, and regional coordinators responsible for gathering contributions and reporting defections. During the 1990s, membership climbed towards 6,000. Pilgrims slept in classrooms on the main compound. They rose before dawn to hold communal fields, attend sermon readings at midday, and sang Marian hymns late into the night. Accounts from defectors describe a steady flow of cash and donated produce moving into a locked storeroom that only the Central Council could open. Group trucks ferried beans, bananas, and goats to weekly markets, converting them to cash that never appeared on formal ledgers. Survivors later told police that obedience was enforced by public beatings and periods of isolation in empty granaries. As the millennium approached, internal pressure grew. In late 1999, dozens of followers asked why none of the Virgin's promised signs, darkened skies, flaming hail, and global earthquakes, had begun. Tithes fell, and small creditors started asking for their money back. Leadership responded by setting a fresh, precise date, March 17, 2000. Preparations took on the feel of a festival schedule. Tailors stitched uniform-style green and black smocks. Butchers in neighboring towns reported large meat orders. Drums of gasoline were delivered to the compound along with jerrycans of sulfuric acid, normally used to treat batteries. Police investigators later concluded that those supplies were stockpiled solely for the final gathering. On the morning of March 17th, several hundred members assembled in the main church, a long building of brick walls and a corrugated iron roof. Windows had been nailed shut the night before. Witnesses from nearby hills heard lengthy hymns, then a blast that blew the roof panels into surrounding banana plots. The structure burned fiercely. No one emerged. Initial counts placed the dead at 330, but the number rose as scorched remains were separated and rebagged. Local officials treated the event as mass suicide. Within days, police found that all exits had been blocked and paraffin had been poured along the aisles. Attention shifted to possible homicide when relatives produced letters written weeks earlier in which believers predicted meeting the Virgin Mary, but made no mention of self-inflicted death. Some teams expanded to other movement properties. At a former school in Buhunga sub-county, they uncovered a pit under the dining hall floor containing 80 bodies in advanced decay. Further excavations at Rugazi and Nuera produced sacks of lime-covered skeletons. Most victims had been stabbed or strangled. Some showed fractures consistent with blunt instruments. When counting stopped, the official death toll reached 780, with estimates ranging past 900 because of fragmentary remains and incomplete local registers. Forensic officers dated several burials to February 2000, indicating killings had begun weeks before the church fire. Neither Kibwetir nor Murende were found among the dead. Witness statements placed both leaders on the compound in the early hours of March 17th, but police believed they left before dawn in a Toyota van driven by a still unidentified associate. International arrest warrants went out in April 2000, charging them with murder, arson and conspiracy. Rumors surfaced in 2014 that Kibwetir had been sighted in Malawi, though Ugandan police have not confirmed the lead. No prosecutions have followed. Most senior members either died in the fire, are missing, or were released for lack of evidence, tying them directly to the killings. Government reaction was blunt. The president of Uganda called the event mass murder for monetary gain, and the vice president described the organizers as criminals posing as clergy. The 48-acre Kanungu site reverted to private ownership and now forms part of a tea estate. The new owner has spoken of erecting a small memorial, but nothing has ever been built. Early wire reports compared Kanungu to Jonestown, framing it as a suicide driven by prophetic disillusion. Later studies argued that most followers were murdered after requesting refunds or threatening defection. The movement accumulated assets through apocalyptic preaching and ended with the violent deaths of most of its adherents. Estimates suggest the organization moved the equivalent of several million US through livestock sales and member donations in its final 2 years. Police theorized that funds were withdrawn in cash and carried across borders. Today, scholars list the movement for the restoration of the Ten Commandments of God among the deadliest new religious movements events of the late 20th century, surpassed only a victim count by a cult that we'll be discussing right now. Really, I had to save this one for last. When it comes to the term cult leader, no one is more infamous and despicable than Jim Jones. Jim Jones was a charismatic young preacher who broke with the Methodist Church in Indianapolis to found his own congregation. In 1956, he established the People's Temple, preaching a blend of Christian revivalism and socialist fervor that drew a racially integrated flock. He even boasted of a, quote, rainbow family of adopted children of different racial backgrounds, a living symbol of his own promise that race didn't matter. He quickly parlayed that energy into civic action. As the chair of the local Human Rights Commission, he helped desegregate theaters and restaurants, and the temple set up free communal dining and group homes for the elderly and mentally ill. By the mid-1960s, Jones had moved his congregation to California. He settled in rural Redwood Valley, and by the early 1970s, he had made San Francisco the center of his operation. There, Jones courted politicians and journalists, offering votes and cash to boost his influence. The temple ran extensive social programs, free drug rehab, medical clinics, and a communal dining hall, which won him public praise. Thousands joined his church, drawn by promises of racial justice and community support. But the shining exterior hid a harsh reality. As his following swelled, former members began to talk. They said temple members were pressured or forced to turn over their savings, homes, or even custody of their children to the church. Dissent was not tolerated. Those who questioned Jones could be beaten, humiliated, or locked up in punishment cells during staged, quote, confession sessions. By 1977, exposés and official reports were piling up, detailing staged healings, coerced labor, and financial fraud. Jones's answer was to promise an escape, a new commune in the jungle. In 1974, a small advance team scouted a 3,000-acre tract of rainforest in remote Guyana. 3 years later, Jones led roughly 1,000 of his most loyal followers into the jungle to build a self-sufficient socialist utopia. He sold it as an agricultural cooperative, rich with food and free of American racism, where they would live in peace.
This is the tank that I was leaning against this tank. Tim and I was pressurizing our well, and I was leaning against this tank when it blew up. You can see it split from the bottom and across the top. And the explosion knocked me 8 feet right through the air. I lit on the ground on my shoulders. I came out without a bruise. The tank and the pump it encircled Tim. The wires broke. They were laying in the water. We were both standing in water, and neither one of us received a shock, bruise, scratched, or nothing. It was just through the loving care of our Father that this miracle was possible. Neither one of us was hurt at all. This is 3/8-inch thick steel, and it sounded like a bomb when it exploded.
My name is Don Swaney, and I'm grateful to be down here. It's more freer down here, and it's more beautiful. Up there, I wouldn't get along with people very much, and down here, I'm getting along with people. I learn about new machineries I haven't even seen before, and it's really getting along great here.
The commune was officially called the People's Temple Agricultural Project. The members nicknamed it Jonestown. Life in Jonestown quickly became a grueling routine. The community carved out farms and built wooden barracks under Jones's direction. Each day began before dawn. Members rose in the jungle darkness to plant and water fields under the sweltering sun. Armed guards in Jones's inner circle patrolled constantly. Personal freedom vanished. Passports and money were locked away. Correspondence was censored, and residents were encouraged to snitch on one another. Jones even had PA speakers rigged throughout the camp. When his recorded sermons played, everyone had to freeze in silence until they finished. The constant pressure and fear drove more and more people to discreetly talk of escape. By late 1978, concerned relatives of temple members in California were desperate for answers. U.S. Representative Leo Ryan, whose district included many former temple voters, agreed to investigate. Against advice from colleagues, Ryan chartered a plane and flew to the jungle on November 17, 1978, with a handful of reporters and family members of worried temple followers. He was the first U.S. politician ever to visit the remote camp. Temple officials staged a warm reception, a dinner and entertainment show to portray a happy, united community. Privately, however, a few frightened residents slipped notes to Ryan's team, begging to be rescued. The mood was tense. The next morning, in a clearing near the airstrip, Ryan's group prepared to depart. A rented dump truck was piled high with luggage and roughly a dozen defectors and relatives who had decided to leave with the congressman.
What happened? Well, we were, all of a sudden, we had a whole lot of people at the last minute who wanted to go, suddenly rushed forward and said, we want to leave. We knew about 2 as early as last night. We knew about a family this morning that said, we got to go. And you have to understand there's a high degree of agitation on the part of those who want to go, and they were really very much in fear. And so we made arrangements for them. Of course, the transportation is extremely limited and very difficult. So we had to begin planning. And of course, most of these people, if they come out, will not have enough food and don't have enough clothing, a place to stay, and the rest. So we had to begin a real operation, at which point we divided up the work, and my responsibility, for among the 3 of us, my assistant and the deputy chief of mission, Snyder and I, my job was to stay behind and get the list of people who wanted to go, make sure they had their stuff, make sure they made their declarations they wanted to leave, and all that, and just keep it straight. And I was doing that, which included going with some of them to get their belongings, because they were reluctant to go back to their buildings alone. And I think in the process, people could see me doing that and were pretty hostile about it, apparently, from the looks they gave and some of the comments they made, not to me, but to the people who were leaving. And the next thing I knew, I was back in the pavilion. We had the group beginning to get together. I stood up and had been talking with the 2 attorneys for the temple. And suddenly the knife was around my neck, and I was in danger. And I pushed the hand away fell back against him. Others grabbed him and pulled him off me. And that's where we are.
Who grabbed him?
Well, everybody did. I think the man closest, because he'd just been talking, it was Mark Lane. Mark, I didn't know at the time, but there was a hand there grabbing for the knife along with mine, and I was very grateful. And we began to ride him down. Others jumped on. There was radio screaming and carrying on and so on. And everybody just jumped on and began riding him down. I sagged and went this way and began leaning backward. And kept doing that until somebody actually got the knife out of his hand. And I jumped up and came away, and he was down on the floor, and they still struggling, and there must have been 6 or 7 people sitting on him, and on arms and legs and everything else.
Did he say anything when he came up?
Yeah, he said something about rob and choke and kill and or knife. I don't know. But what he said was he intended to kill me because he's going to something about this is what you're going to get or something. I don't know. I don't recall. This knife is awfully big and awfully strong.
What are you going to do now?
Well, I think put it all together. I think it's very different from what I thought I would find in both positive and negative ways, and I think it's a matter now of just kind of falling back and regrouping and seeing what we have. In the first place, we've got some people.
Suddenly, a hail of gunfire erupted. A tractor-trailer loaded with armed Temple loyalists roared onto the airstrip. In seconds, 5 people were killed: Congressman Ryan, an NBC cameraman, an Examiner photographer, and 2 defectors. Larry Layton, a Temple aide aboard one plane, drew a pistol and wounded 2 of the fleeing passengers before others disarmed him. Witnesses later said coldly, quote, "They were shooting to kill, not just to stop us from leaving." The planes took off without Ryan's party. Back at Jonestown, the sound of gunfire triggered the nightmare Jones had prepared. He gathered everyone into the main pavilion under armed guard. Jones warned that American troops were coming to slaughter them and that they must die first on their own terms. He called it a, quote, revolutionary suicide, saying it was their only way out. Then, Temple medics mixed a lethal drink, grape-flavored Flavor Aid, laced with cyanide and sedatives. First, the children were brought forward. Nurses and parents forced the poison into their mouths as distraught mothers watched and cried. When the children were gone, Jones directed the adults. One by one, they lined up and drank the poison under the watch of armed guards. Some obeyed without hesitation, others gulped down the cup while weeping. Those who resisted either had the drink forced down their throats or were injected with the poison via syringe. The hall filled with the sound of choking and moaning as the poison took effect. When Guyanese soldiers and doctors arrived at Jonestown on November 19th, the jungle commune was deathly silent. By official count, 909 people lay dead there, about 1/3 of them children. Many had died with loved ones in their arms. Jim Jones was slumped in a chair with a bullet wound in his head. It's debated whether he pulled the trigger himself or if he had one of his aides do it for him. The drinking cups and syringes were still on the table. A dream Jones had sold of land and freedom had become a nightmare of poison and gunfire. By dawn, the dream was over. Jonestown was over. In Oakland, California, more than 400 unclaimed bodies were later buried in a mass grave, a silent memorial to the victims. The crime was complete. A cult leader killed a congressman and masterminded the deaths of almost 1,000 followers. It remains one of history's darkest true crime stories. In the end, a charismatic preacher who once promised a better world delivered only tragedy. And that's the end of the video, folks. I'm sorry I didn't play any of the Jonestown death tape like a lot of you were probably expecting. The video might have gotten age restricted if I had, and I just can't stand Jim Jones's voice in that tape. The way he's lisping and groaning all of his words in that southern drawl makes him sound like Dusty Rhodes if he was a junkie. Anyway, thank you very much for watching. Be sure to like this video, leave a comment, subscribe if you're new, and consider supporting on Patreon. I'll see you all next time. Goodbye.